2024 is the year of the MMO, World of Warcraft, and Final Fantasy XIV, receiving the War Within and Dawn Trail expansion packs respectively. But alongside every new MMO expansion comes an age-old question. How do we fix expansions for MMOs? Well, you see, there's a underlying issue, a problem if you will, that every expansion for both these games suffer in one way or the other, and both of these games have tried to remedy this to the best of their abilities, and that is the simple reality that the game gets smaller, or progresses horizontally with each expansion. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, in my opinion, one of the best aspects of MMORPGs, and what drew me into both of these games for so long, is the feeling of being in this giant online world. The worlds of World of Warcraft and Final Fantasy XIV are absolutely enthralling, and you can easily lose yourself in hours and hours of just sheer exploration and uncovering the secrets that these worlds provide for you. They aren't designed to be consumed in 10 hours, 40 hours, or even 100 hours. They are designed for you to spend time in for upwards of 1,000 hours, if not tens of thousands of hours. But time goes on, and new content is required to keep the experience feeling fresh and new. So expansions come out, and they introduce new zones, new regions for you to explore. But the problem is, a lot of the time, most of the time that you'll dedicate to the game from that point on will now take place in that new confined space. Instead of the entire world feeling like it was in the beginning, over time the world feels far more narrow in scope and less grand and epic than those first moments when you booted up the game all those years ago. And then from then on out, essentially you repeat that process each expansion. Sure, you're getting new zones, and technically the world is getting bigger with each step of the way, but really, the effective range of the useful activities that you are going to pursue is confined to a small location rather than the entire world itself. It's one of the reasons that I think classic WoW has taken off like it has. Because Azeroth is such a great world to just be in and spend time in and explore and play in. And classic WoW utilizes all of Azeroth that was there in vanilla WoW, which is just a sheer bigger location and ends up feeling like more of a world than zones designed for an expansion. No, that's not a knock on a lot of the zone design that we've got in both of these games in later years. Ask most Final Fantasy XIV players, and I doubt you'll hear anyone say that they don't love the locations from Shadowbringers and Endwalker. I love them. They're some of my favorite locations in any game of all time. But I'm not talking about specific zone design, I'm talking about the feeling of being in an interconnected world. And a lot of the times we can talk about convenience, talk about ease of transport, or just user-friendliness. But a lot of the times, it's when we're struggling that we find ourselves most enthralled with exploring and being entertained with a world. But that doesn't last forever, because if you spend enough time in any of these games, you'll eventually know the nooks and crannies, you'll know the corners, you'll be able to look at a texture up close and know exactly what zone you're in. That is undefeatable. You can't overcome that. But I think there's a difference in the idea of accepting that you can't overcome that, and at least trying to mitigate those effects. And I think World of Warcraft and Final Fantasy XIV, to some degree, have attempted to overcome that feeling throughout the years. See, Final Fantasy XIV is a very story-heavy game. It's a Final Fantasy game first, MMORPG second. And the way that that game overcomes a lot of its inherent issues of being an MMORPG going on for over 10 years at this point is by having the story bring you back to some of these older locations. Never letting you forget that Eorzea exists, or that Kugane exists, or that Doma exists, etc., etc. The game's not afraid to have you go back to these locations. Even in the recent content patch, we went back to the location from Shadowbringers, catching up with the people that we met along the way. And that is brilliant in my opinion, because people want new things. They want to spend time in the new stuff to explore those new locations and to be able to be enthralled with those new locations. They've already spent hundreds, if not thousands, if not tens of thousands of hours in the older locations. They want a new experience. That's fundamental. That's honestly understandable. I'm like that as well. But every now and then we can have you go back to these older locations for whatever reason, just to remind you that the world is big and vast. Is it a 100% foolproof strategy to completely undermine this inherent feeling all MMOs, or at least most of them, suffer from? No. But it's at least an honest attempt at trying to address the issue. Well, what about World of Warcraft? Well, WoW over the years has had a couple of ideas to tackle these issues. Two main ones in my opinion, and they're both open world content. Back in Mists of Pandaria, there's a patch called 5.3. And in this patch, they retrofitted some areas from the Barrens, which is a zone from Vanilla that got changed with Cataclysm, and they put a bunch of new kind of little daily quest hubs in there that were relevant for the recent content, that flowed with the story. Wasn't the most well-received piece of content ever, because let's be honest, if you played it, it wasn't as good as the Thunder King Isle. But in my opinion, it was nice to be back in the Barrens, and for that place to be lore relevant again. And then, later on, in Battle for Azeroth, I feel like I have to wash my tongue with 20 different chemicals just because of uttering that blasphemy. But there is an aspect of Battle for Azeroth that I think is severely underrated, and not talked about because of how poorly received the rest of Battle for Azeroth was, and that is the idea of going back to some of these older locations and letting the world feel like it's progressing. The Siege of Undercity. Not the most well-executed story moment in the game's history, let's be honest, but the idea of going back to a familiar location, one of these racial cities, and having an entire battle go on there, that was cool. Could have been handled better, but the idea was sound. Evolving the world of Warcraft through Warcraft. And then Warfronts. Yeah, Warfronts as a system sucked, because they were far too easy and underdeveloped, but you can't lie to me and tell me it wasn't cool going back to the Arathi Highlands or Darkshore, and having these zones evolve with the story, get a few texture upgrades here and there. Darkshore was freaking sick. I loved what they had going on with the moon and all that. That was badass. A giant battle between life and death with the Night Elves versus the Forsaken. It was cool. And they gave you new little daily hubs to go farm out, and new raids to farm for mounts or whatever. It gave you a reason to be back in the old world, reminding you that you're still in Azeroth at the end of the day, which in some of these recent expansions for World of Warcraft, where aesthetically it feels so disconnected from the roots of Warcraft, it's nice to be reminded of where it all began, and that the rest of the world wasn't completely forgotten. Now, Warcraft over the years, and same thing with Final Fantasy XIV, have had other ways to try and tackle this same issue. Because this is honestly an issue that I don't think can be resolved, or will be resolved mostly, by completely undermining the feeling of the world getting smaller. I don't think that's just the direction most of these games will take. Developer resources are inherently limited, and you can't just keep increasing the size and scope of the effective play area of relevant content over and over and over again, because you'll eventually hit a point of no return, where it'll just start to feel too big, let alone all the technical limitations that come along with that. It's an understandable, albeit kind of disappointing reality of the industry. But I do like it when both of these games have their attempts at reminding you that the old worlds still exist. Now, this wasn't meant to be a bit of a competitive video between these two games, but there is one other aspect to this that I do think is kind of important, and that is the idea of how do you introduce these new locations, and how do you incorporate them with the rest of the game? Because I would bet my left testicle that no one at Blizzard thought of the Isle of freaking Dawn or whatever, or Hollowfall, back in the days of Vanilla WoW. So with them being added to the War Within, it just kind of feels like, oh, okay, well that wasn't there before, but sure, okay, we can kind of buy it. It feels like an arbitrary addition to a world that has already been pre-established. At least with Mists of Pandaria, we knew there was a Pandaria, because that was established in Warcraft 3, but it was shrouded in mists, and because of the events of the Cataclysm, Pandaria got unveiled for the entire world, and stepped out onto the world stage. That was an interesting way to incorporate Pandaria into the greater world. But when it comes to some of these newer locations for World of Warcraft, they just kind of feel arbitrary in their implementation. Now, what about Final Fantasy XIV? Well, with Dawntrail, we're getting the new world. You see, the Final Fantasy XIV world is kind of loosely based off the geography of Earth if you squint a little bit. So the new world is meant to be, well, the new world. North and South America. But the new world isn't new to the lore of Final Fantasy XIV, it's been referenced. We've had quest lines, and even unlocked a limited job with Blue Mage via characters that came from the new world, that taught us their magics and their ways and their history, and a little bit of their culture, and some of the strife that they've been undergoing for various reasons. The new world's been established, we can see it from the moon, that's a thing, but now we're finally getting the chance to go there. So to me, it just feels more natural in its implementation. Which, let's be honest, this isn't the most groundbreaking or earth-shattering subject of import when it comes to the health and longevity of an MMORPG. We can be honest with that, but we can also, well, be honest with the idea that not everything has to be. Sometimes it's nice to have a little bit of appreciation for how these things can be implemented into a game. And even the War Within, in some regard, is doing a pretty damn good job of implementing new locations. I forget the name of the new Nerubian place, you know, the spider people? We knew they had a giant, complex under the ground. We knew that, but we're finally going to go and adventure through it. That is really cool. This piece of WoW lore and history of Azeroth that we've always been able to peer into, but not entirely through the veil. Now we're going to go down into the weeds of it and explore it, and develop it and flesh it out. That's a really cool idea. And the fact that WoW can still do that after all these years says a ton. And I also think that it says a ton about the recent direction shift WoW has had in the last year or so, that I'm far more a fan of than where we've been going with the game. So yeah, it's been an age-old question and a bit of a sore spot, either actively for a lot of people or even passively, and some people may not have ever realized it. The beauty of MMORPGs, in my opinion, is the feeling of being in this vast open world with a bunch of other players. But with each expansion, well, the scope is inherently limited, being brought down to a more of an expansion-sized chunk of content. And then the world of it ends up feeling all that much bigger because next go around, well, you just go to another similarly sized piece of area. It's more like horizontal progression in terms of developing the world than just making it feel larger and bigger. And the only time you're ever reminded, in fact, of how big Azeroth or Final Fantasy XIV can really be is when you open up the map or the fast travel system. And I would love to see both of these games find new and new ways of trying to just at least remind the player of how big the world is, and trying to invoke that old school sense of scale. Because I think a lot of people are remembering how cool it can be when you feel like you have an entire world to explore, not just one little small piece of area. And that's largely thanks to classic WoW in a lot of ways, because both Kalimdor and the Eastern Kingdoms are explorable for the player. And you don't have that many ways of easily navigating that world. You slog through it, you walk through it, or you mount up on it with 40% speed and go through it. Set up a Hearthstone, whatever. And sure, it may be inconvenient, but it helps make the world feel big. And in a game like classic WoW, that can be important, extremely important. And just developing the world, making it feel natural in a place that you feel like you belong in. Now, I don't think every expansion from here on out can be as big as classic WoW in that regard, or invoke that same feeling. But I think having ideas and mechanics that may bring you back to the old world every now and then, it may not completely remedy the situation or the problem, but I think it can be a good salve for the wound. And not like Magni Bronzebeard either, like the wound champion. Not like that, but you know what I mean. You know, it's one of the things where I just don't really get mad at. It's just an interesting observation. Because I think it's understandable why neither of these companies can put out a world as big as classic WoW of both Eastern Kingdoms and Kalimdor every 2 years. I feel like that's understandable, right? But I say go wild with it. Have stuff like Ishgard Restoration, bringing us back to older locations and trying to retrofit them to our modern day. Have quest lines that bring us back to these older locations as well. Have story events that shift and turn the tides of battle and the battle lines. Like the battle for Undercity. Just do it better. And stuff like Warfronts. Not like the actual mechanic of Warfronts, but the idea of going back to an older zone and changing it up. And showing that the world is still continuing to evolve. And reminding the player of the sense of scale that the world has. And that these zones haven't been completely forgotten. We don't need to go to Fairlass every 2 patches or whatever. But you know what I mean. Having that patch where we go back to the Barrens for whatever reason, that's cool. Having a patch where we go back to Darkshore or whatever is cool. Id Midnight was supposed to go back to Quel'Thalas, and the Last Titan was supposed to go back to Northrend. That is cool, and I love it when these developers are able to have these interesting and unique ways of reminding us, the player, that these worlds are still large and enticing. So here's what I want you to do, and here's where you come in. Leave a comment in the comments down below with your possible solution to this root issue. Do you think it's fine with how it's currently being handled by both of these games? Do you think one game's doing it better than the other? Do you have an interesting solution about this? Let me know. I'd love to hear your thoughts and hear your opinions. I'd love to hear them. And with that, I think I'll call the video there for the day. Thank you all for tuning in. My pleasure for making the video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out and help support future content, and I greatly appreciate it. Stay safe, have a great day, and I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye, everybody. Till we meet again.